Hey, what's happening? Before we jump into the show, I wanted to see if you had any music on a hard drive. You have a band, you have a project, and you want to self-release your own music. Well, there's an easy way to do it. You can go to distrokid.com/VIP/hyphenate and go get your music up on all the streamers. You keep 100% of your royalties, and you can get 30% off by using this code. It's a great, easy way to get your music up on the streamers and share it with your fans, your friends, your family, your mom, your dog, everybody. Everyone wants to hear it. But go to distrokid.com/VIP/hyphenate, HYPHENATE, and send me the link. I want to hear it too. Send your mom the link. Send your dog the link. They all want to hear it too. We'd like to thank our sponsor, iZotope, the absolute leaders in intuitively designed plugins for audio restoration, mixing, and mastering. At iZotope.com, you'll find a plethora of tools and suites that will enhance your audio production, whether it's voice, video, podcast, or a full production recording session. Check out the industry-standard audio repair tool, RX11, or the multi-tool mixer plugin, Neutron 5, or the powerful Ozone 11 mastering suite, plus tons more. Go to iZotope.com and use the code FRET10 at checkout for 10% off. That's FRET10 to get 10% off at checkout. And again, the website is iZotope.com, IZOTOPE.com.
Keep in mind that, many of us writers who have primarily written digitally, that doesn't mean your work's going to last. I pretty much assume that my work is not going to last. That sounds depressing.
What's happening? Thank you so much for tuning into Hyphenate with me, your host, Randy Randall. This is our episode for Thursday, July 17th. Hope everybody's surviving the heat and surviving America as this monstrosity of nightmares belligerently battles on in the world. On today's show, I am very happy to share with you this great interview I did with music journalist Ned Raggett. Ned is incredible, as you will hear in a few minutes, and boy, can he talk. But he has such a nice, sonorous voice made for radio that it is very enjoyable. So I get to sit back and relax with me as we listen to the stories of Ned Raggett. Ned has been a prolific music journalist here in Southern California. Now he's based up in the Bay Area. But I first came across his writing in the 90s as I was a budding shoegaze noise fan, and the nascent internet was just beginning to bloom. I came across an interview that he did at KUCI, or at the University of Irvine, where he interviewed Kevin Shields. And this was sort of in the fallow time of My Bloody Valentine, post-Loveless, where they weren't really very active. And so I was looking for any information I could find. I was scouring this new thing called the World Wide Web to find out any information, any updates, any news, because I was just getting into My Bloody Valentine, but they had already ostensibly broken up. And so I was, just doing what every nerd was doing at the time when the internet first became a thing, was looking up whatever my obsessions were and the things I was in love with and trying to find out more information about them. And so I came across this interview that Ned had done with Kevin Shields over the phone somewhere in the mid-90s. And it was incredible. I loved it. It was like the one piece of, journalistic drop of water in a desert of nothing. No information about My Bloody Valentine, but this one was like, okay, Kevin Shields is still alive. He's talking to this guy Ned Raggett. Okay, this is so cool. And I think I remember sending away like $1 for the full transcript, but Ned thinks the whole transcript was up there. Maybe I just printed out the whole transcript and kept it in my like high school notebook and would refer back to it, trying to find, what was the magic that this wizard, what kind of morsels or what kind of insights I could glean from this noise wizard that I was in love with, and the music that was just transfixing me and just mysticizing my adolescence. And that's where I first came across Ned. And then I think years later, as No Age was going, I talked with him a little bit about Disco Inferno, another great English band, UK band. And I think we had shared something to do with Disco Inferno and those late aughts. I've just kind of kept in touch and followed him and read his writings and just when thinking about interviewing people and who've done a lot of things, and he's works in the library system during the day and then writes prolifically about music. And his life is filled, with incredible writing, great. If you like me and you're a fan of the bands that I'm a fan of, then chances are you'll have already read some of Ned Raggett's writing. But if you haven't, go search him up. He has an incredible Patreon that you can join. Where is it at here? There's also his WordPress that comes up on the first sort of looking up there, but his Patreon is patreon.com patreon.com/Ned Raggett, NEDRAGGETT. I will have it linked down in the show notes below, but go follow him there. It's the best place to follow all of his writings and what he's up to. He also writes or has written for the for Bandcamp, and like I said, his WordPress is a great sort of archive of a lot of his earlier writings. Yeah, I see this page here about where he writes about seeing My Bloody Valentine in 1992, and has pictures of his ticket stubs, seeing them at the Palace and also seeing them at the Roxy. Tiny little theater. I can't imagine My Bloody Valentine just blowing the walls out of the Roxy on February 4th, 1992 with who was opening this show. It doesn't say on here. Wow. Yo La Tengo looks like. Insane. How fun is that? So there is, and Babes in Toyland, is that right too? Okay, lots of great stuff. So anyway, follow Ned Raggett, go find him, and yeah, very stoked to share this interview. Yeah, it's a funny thing about the early days of internet and what we looked up. I remember first getting a computer at home, and it was like looked up skateboarding, websites. I remember Tumyeto was an early website that I found, they had in their catalogs. Like if you bought a board from them or bought a shirt, they'd send you the catalog and it had a website on there. That was one of the early ones. And then like southerndistribution.com. It was another like epic portal of music knowledge and up-to-date tour date listings. And then, and I would just like, it was those funny things. There wasn't a lot of content out there, but where you could find websites and things, it was like, okay, I've just soaked it all up. So those mid-90s, early internet days were great for finding out things about, where tour dates of where bands, when they were going to come to Los Angeles. And then just, interviews of defunct bands that I couldn't find anything out about that weren't in magazines. So then I had, finding anything you could. It's crucial to those early days. So yeah, here is my interview with Ned Raggett. Enjoy. Ned, thanks so much for jumping on Hyphenate. Very excited to get to chat.
It's going to be fun, yeah. So I'm still settling in and adjusting and things like that. So, but happy to chat and looking forward to it for sure.
Yeah, we were talking right before I hit record, and you definitely have a voice for radio, and you've spent some time on the radio. I think that's where I first learned of you through the early bowels of the nascent internet, probably mid to late 90s. You had a transcript of an interview you did with the elusive Kevin Shields that I think was up online, and there was a mention on this early webpage of send a postage paid stamped envelope to receive the whole transfer, because I think it was only a clip of it online. So I wrote you. I wrote you through the radio station at UCI, I believe, or somewhere.
Yeah, I don't remember that factor at all, to be utterly honest. I'm not saying you're maybe confusing me with someone else, but I remember specifically typing up that transcript in the era when you absolutely had to type up a transcript and putting the full thing up online, because that was the only way people could get to it, because at the time we weren't regularly hosting files, because that was like the mid-90s. Yeah. So yeah, no, you shouldn't have had to write in for me for that one. It was all there.
Maybe I just printed it all out then. Maybe that's what it was.
Yeah,
but at some point we did meet up at Spaceland, and you did give me a full file of it. Or printout of some kind. Yeah. So this was...
Yeah, wow, man, you got a better memory than me in these things. I'm like, okay, I remember Spaceland, obviously, and things like that, but okay, all right, cool.
I know, well, yeah, it was all a little fuzzy for me too, but this was my baby bat brain of first learning about, shoegaze and, kind of moving as I would. I was born in 81, so never mind into Sonic Youth and Goo Daydream Nation, and then into My Bloody Valentine, and then just losing my mind and just trying to devour as much as you could at that time because the internet was not what it was, and obviously the band they had disbanded, and just buying up everything I could. And then as soon as the internet comes along, I'm like, how do I find more about this Kevin Shields fellow? And I think I had stumbled upon your interview with him. So that's just, I guess, just as a way in. That's where you first came upon my radar as a young kid searching for music. But your story obviously starts much farther back than that. Where do you come from? How did you first get interested in music?
Yeah, who am I? Well, let's see. Learning you were born in 81, I'm like, oh, okay, that gives me some perspective because I was born in 71.
There we go. Okay, all right, so about 10 years apart.
So for you, so for me, sort of like, my growing up in musical years would have been, the 80s, and especially the late 80s is really when it kicked in. Kind of sounds like it was for you. It's sort of like, around when you're, 20 years in, you're like, what else is out there? So realistically, it was kind of like more on the cusp of the 90s. But, after initially getting grips of music, maybe stepping back, I mean, I'm not going to proclaim myself any different from almost any other kid out there, but who just grows up in, music and simple songs and things like this. That's just part of what you are and grow up. It helped that, early 70s was, just the first few years in of Sesame Street, of course, very much a favorite thing. Watching it there, I'm sure my mom sang me more than a few nursery rhymes, but I also remember things like a classic Fisher-Price plastic toy, which was essentially a music box. And this music box, I think there's a little photo of me somewhere with this music box, if I remember right. And the thing with this music box is it had records, but they were essentially like cartridges that were multicolored vinyl, but multicolored pressed to look like vinyl. But really the idea is you set them in the player and they would go around and it was a music box designed to look like a vinyl player. And so it would just do these little chime things of just various familiar things and little, again, rhymes and stuff like that. And it was sort of like, oh, wow, cool. You did this, you put the thing on there and you got music. And very soon after that, I had my first record player. And I kind of wish I had held on to this one because it was fascinating because the settings on it, you have to do some wiring to get it to work these days. So settings on those were perfect because it was I couldn't tell you the brand, I couldn't tell you anything about it. I don't think there's even a photograph of this. And we're talking like mid 70s now. And it had settings for 33, 45, and 78. And, these days I'm like, man, I wish I had a 78 player around. I actually go one or two random things on there be fun to play. It would need a whole lot of work to be where we're talking about a little kids thing. It's probably better. I don't know. It's probably better than one of those Crosleys now, honestly. So,
yeah.
to be very honest. But in any event, at that time is when I first started getting a record collection. And these were, of course, kids' records. We're talking about things like Disney released soundtrack with Sorcerer's Apprentice music and Peter and the Wolf, their versions of it on there. And a lot of, again, Sesame Street records, but other kids' records too. And the one I still have, and I'm kind of glad I still have this, it is around. I don't know why I kept it above all the others, but there's this guy who is totally forgotten now, who in the mid part of the 20th century, we're talking like, World War II era, well, pre and post, but all that, guy named Frank Luther. Now, if you talk to most people, you're like, Frank Luther? Who's Frank Luther? Go to Wikipedia and just read this insane Wikipedia page sometime to get a sense of it, because Frank Luther was the god of kids' music in America in that time, in the middle of the century. And so it's one of those things that, he doesn't come down in like, you think Frank in mid-century, think Sinatra. It's like, okay, no, this guy was probably even bigger than that. He was a record company head, but he was also a performer, and he got there by performing. And he came up in incipient country terms, but he also sort of worked with like, country swing and swing era stuff. And again, big band stuff, and became big with kids music. And so it's a little glib to say the Rafi of like the 1940s to use a more versa. And of course, you could have even more famous kids music ones these days, but it's not that far removed because he was that omnipresent. And this was a 33 and a half, RPM vinyl record repressing of some of his early like 45s or maybe even 78s that were released back then, and those style of albums, the old style, like you made things where you fold them on, they were like one on each side, those type of stuff. And so it just compiled from that. And some of those melodies and some of those things have not left my head. I have a rip of it around somewhere so I can play it every so often. And I'm like, yeah. And that stuff like that, it just sunk in the brain because, again, I played it on all these other kids' albums all that time. And so it's just weird to think that sort of has lingered with me. And I like the fact that I have that one connection back to the kid me that I still have around. It's sort of like it all starts somewhere. It all starts somewhere. And again, by the 70s, I think he was still just alive, but he essentially New Generations against Sesame Street and all that. So this was like a little removed. I'm sure my mom had this record or had a repress or found it and thought I would like it and things like this. Maybe she remembered it when she was a kid. She was born in 44. But so to have that is this weird, just fun little connection. So that's, in brief, that's where it all started. And the short version from there, because again, I could go on forever, is I get used to the fact that there's this thing called radio in the late 70s. By 81, I have asked I'm 10 years old. I've asked my mom if I can have a radio. I'm listening to Top 40 nonstop, Mighty 690 down in San Diego. I should mention where I'm from. I was going to do that. But got on the Top 40 tip, and eventually was doing that. And eventually by the mid 80s, we're talking getting into, more MTV and starting to learn more about more underground stuff, and it goes from there. But to back up and answer your other question briefly, I was born in Bremerton, Washington, across Puget Sound from Seattle, but I didn't stay there. And anyone who knows Bremerton probably can guess why. My dad was in the Navy. My dad was a naval officer. He had graduated from the academy in 62. He's from California, and so is my mom, but they actually met out in Hawaii. My dad was stationed out there, young officer. My mom had gone there, having gotten her teacher credential to teach, and she thought she would live there forever, but she met my dad at a party. Things went from there. And when you're in the Navy, you get assigned various spots and you go to them. But my dad was in the subfleet, so it was a little more specific. So my earliest memories, as I mentioned, with all these albums and the music box and things like this, were from Hawaii. And from 79 to 81, I lived in the Bay Area, where I am now, in Mare Island, which was still then a naval base in the north part of the bay near Vallejo. And in 81 to 80, from 82 to 85, I lived in upstate New York, where there is a landlocked naval training base for working on nukes, working on things for people who are working in nuke stuff. So you practice on nukes. So that way we're talking reactors, not missiles.
Subs,
so the idea being
submarine.
So the idea of something goes wrong, you step outside and you're in as opposed to, something goes wrong, you immediately drown, things like that. So, when you're practicing. So those were like the specific places. However, everywhere else I've lived, until I went to UCLA in 1988, would have been in San Diego, specifically Coronado, the island in the bay, its own little self-contained universe, for better or for worse, for various different levels. We'll leave it at that. It was very exclusionary in many ways. I still remember going to UCLA, people looking through my yearbook. I'm like, Ned, did they run? And we're talking about people from all over LA, just everyone makes a very broad range of people. They look at my yearbook and they're like, Ned, did the KKK run people not like you out of town? And I'm like, no, I don't think so. He said innocently. It was, you could say that it was designed for a certain crew to live in. Let's put it that way, though, I'm sure in the past.
You probably don't have to dig too far to see the origins of that. Yeah.
But in any event, that is where I mostly grew up because my dad was often stationed at the Navy base that's over in Point Loma, which is a big sub base. My parents had made a canny decision to actually buy a house in Coronado after renting for a bit in 77. And they did so thinking, we'll probably come back here because of the, sub bases, a little smaller concentration. And my dad was also a pretty solid officer. And I'm sure request to be like, hey, it'd be nice. Sort of came to play. And that turned out to be the case. The 2 times that we were away in Mare Island and upstate New York, the house was just rented to other Navy families who needed a place to stay. So it all worked out in the end. And that's where it went. And then the short version of history from there, 88 to 92, UCLA. 92 through 2015, UC Irvine in Orange County, few years of grad school and then working there. And then from 2015 to now, in fact, literally almost 10 years to the day, has been here in San Francisco.
Oh, wow. It's amazing. And then the crossover with local music or kind of, homegrown music scenes. I mean, it sounds like San Diego was more childhood, but into your teens. I mean, what were you going to shows or what were you sort of devouring musically as a San Diego resident? Not much?
No, that's a very good question. So, again, when I was more consciously paying attention to music, again, we're talking 70, if we're talking 70 stuff, we're talking about things like, I saw Star Wars when I was 6 because it came out in 77. You can guess my mind.
The perfect age.
So,
yeah,
exactly.
Right,
so I will watch and take in everything since then, and I have quite happily. Yay, Andor. And so that soundtrack, of course, heavy imprinting. But
Sure.
again, it was Mare Island 80-81 is when I first started. When it was like, music, radio songs, things like Donna Summer's late disco era, Gary Newman's Cars, Barbara Streisand and Barry Gibb, those that era songs and things like that on the radio, and just post disco, you could say. And I was like, oh, okay. And then what happened was, as I mentioned, was basically listening to top 40 from 81 to about 86, and that covers briefly in Coronado. I mentioned the Mighty 690 San Diego area station down in Mexico, upstate New York. Top 40 stations there, and then back to Coronado listening top 40. And notice I keep saying top 40. Notice I keep saying that. I'm not really paying attention to local scenes in any of these things. To me, it's more like music is just this stuff out there, but I'm just this, middle school or high school kid, just things like that, just going like, okay. And to give people an idea, if you don't know about to say a little more where it's in upstate New York, that was in Saratoga Springs, whereas where we live near this Navy base. Now, also in Saratoga Springs is Skidmore College. You can bet there were college acts coming through at that time that had I known, I'd be like, I'm sure REM played there at least once when I was living there. But I would have been, 13? I wouldn't have known who they were because I didn't know who they were because I wouldn't have, one, really known where to look, and two, didn't know any people talking about them. We were all talking about what was popular. A lot of people had MTV at that point, and a lot of people were just otherwise top 40. That's kind of what we were hearing. I say collectively we.
Sure.
But that's my sense of it. So, but I didn't get a sense of, there's local acts or local musicians or things, even though, there had to have been, but I didn't know. I really didn't know. It didn't really clock. It didn't really kick in. I would say that towards the end, when I came back to Coronado in 85, and then I mentioned sort of tapered off my top 40 listing, sort of tapered off in 86. I stopped listening to the station. I had 1 year of basically doing a lot of reading. And then I had what I like to call my classic rock phase, where I was listening to classic rock station. And I like classic rock phases for a simple reason. They're good to have, and then they're good to leave. It's sort of like I got what I needed because the playlist is essentially limited, and there you go. So I took in a lot of things.
There's no new music on the classic rock.
Yeah, you get a skewed history of what it is. So this is from 87 to 88. I'm like, Led Zeppelin. Oh, so Pink Floyd wasn't just that one disco-y song I heard, things like that.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, I am also listening heavily to, I start buying CDs at that point, the Pet Shop Boys, George Michael, lots of other things I could name too. I'm taking things in bit by bit by bit. And again, when I go to college in UCLA in 1988, fall in 1988, things really explode from there. I start working at the radio station there, et cetera, et cetera. But to take it back to your question, again, I wasn't really going to many shows. The only shows I went to through high school, I can literally count on my hand the 3 shows I went to of all through both middle school and high school total. And they would have been in middle school in 84. My first ever concert was because Saratoga Springs has this thing called SPAC, Saratoga Performing Arts Center. It is a big indoor/outdoor arena performance thing, type of place where you get big bands coming through. You do. Famously, the Grateful Dead came through there in 83, and like the papers are full of stories about, oh my God, the Dead are here. What the, type thing, from there. Again, Skidmore College. But they had a base. But it was the type of place where like the New York City Ballet and the Philadelphia Orchestra had their summer seasons. It's that type of spot.
Yeah.
And what happens is that the first ever, I decide I really want to go see a show. I'm like, and it's like, Dad, can we go? I was like, okay. And so he takes me, he and a fellow naval officer and his wife and me, the 4 of us go and see. Thank my dad forever for this indulgence, and this is a very 1984. This is the 1984 nobody talks about lineup. It was my first ever show was 38 Special, who were huge at that time. The Tour de Force album was big. No one talks about it now, but it was legit big on MTV. They were the headliners with Night Ranger opening.
Oh,
so
wow.
I got the full Sister Christian You Can Still Rock in America experience. They were entertaining. And then later that year, saw another act that my dad liked too. And they've always been a band I've always liked. And when I heard later that they had fallen out of favor until they got a revival, I'm like, what do you mean fallen out of favor? They were always great. And they was Hall & Oates. And I saw them for the Big Band Boom Tour, which was essentially the end of their own major Imperial phase from the late 70s to the mid 80s, because they were just, they were on radio all the time, rightfully. And that would have been that. And then after that, the next time I saw a big show like that, any kind of show, big or small, would have been Sting in summer of '88. Nothing Like the Sun tour with Steel Pulse opening. So that was also when I first saw first reggae band. But that was it. It was one of those things that, in retrospect, I'm kind of glad, to a degree, that I didn't pick up on as many local things going around. And it would have been nice because, San Diego had its own like punk garage scene and things going on, and lots of other things were happening. And were I aware of them, I might have been able to go to more of them and all that. I was like, learned later, a lot of my classes were like, we were going to Hillcrest all the time and all that. And I'm like, I should have gone with you. But again, I was a little more self-contained, a little more shy at that point, or just sort of like introverted, whatever. And I wasn't going to Tijuana or anything like that. I mean, all my classmates were like, fake ID south of the border. And I'm like, I don't care. And so I really don't. And that just was never for me. And what happened is that
did you have I was going to jump in. Did you have older siblings or younger siblings? Were you?
No, I'm the oldest. That's the thing too. Okay, yeah. Gotcha, so I didn't have. I didn't have any sort of. Yeah, no sort of guiding figure. Although ironically, this is something that's very important. So I mentioned what I was listening to musically. First top 40, bleed into MTV, and then a little more into this classic rock stuff and all that. Now my sister, my younger sister, by 3 years, is well ahead of me on the hip chain. In fact, she taught me implicitly because she was listening to 91X, which, as anyone from the area will know, is the San Diego equivalent to K-Rock, and very much has that same cachet, same time period. They were across the border, so they had they were officially a Mexican station, but they were essentially broadcasting to an English language audience. But basically San Diego and Tijuana and that whole area were just like, that was where you got your modern rock, is what it was, because K-Rock was too far away. And 91X covered that completely and was its own market, was its own thing. And so she was listening to that, and she was listening to things like the Pretty in Pink soundtrack, and things like, I remember she endlessly played Erasure Sometimes, which was their first notable American hit on a low-key level. I was looking, it's like, who is this band? And things like this. And these are all these bands that I was going to say that I'm glad I didn't really get into in high school, because when I got to them properly when I went to college, partially because I was surrounded by people for whom they had grown up around K-Rock, because so many people from LA, and this was their music. And I'm like, okay, what is this? Let me get the grips of this. Because I had heard initial breakthroughs from things like The Cure and Love and Rockets and New Order in like 87. They were getting top 40 play. They were getting TV play. I couldn't miss them. And I'm like, this is pretty good. So I'm getting more into that. But that's memories associated with a college. So all my awkward high school memories are soundtracked by other things. And I'm fine with that. I'm like, great.
Turn the page. Now college begins. Now the young adulthood happens, and the music gets better or more interesting or more,
right.
Varied.
And my fondness for bands like I'll say again, The Cure and all these bands I mentioned. I very still in my heart, but I didn't really clock into getting their albums and things until college, and I associate it more with that. A band like Duran Duran, I very much associated with middle school and high school because I bought Rio back in '83. That was a formative album. And I will also say that my two most formative albums in middle school early on easily would have been Duran Duran's Rio and Def Leppard's Pyromania. And you can draw a lot of my taste from those two albums because they're both quote unquote rock bands, granted. But Duran Duran, that eventually leads me to ties to continuing back to bands like Japan, but also Roxy Music, glam rock, etc., things like this, but also synths, electronics, artier stuff, eventually connects to Depeche Mode. It goes all sorts of different crazy directions in many different directions there. And as for Def Leppard, same thing. Also the glam rock heritage, granted, but, loud riffs, guitars, feedback. Oh, and there's a lot to explore from there. It goes from there. So, those two albums were very foundational, but I didn't appreciate how foundational they were until I went to college. And then I really started opening up my palette, if it were.
And is this also when writing about music begins, or music journalism? I mean, there's a radio show. How does that?
Okay, yeah. So here's how that goes. So I mentioned the radio station at UCLA, KLA, which I think is just now called UCLA Radio. It was weirdly enough, it was a station in advance of its time, because at the time it was only carried on cable radio. You couldn't actually, there was no broadcast space. There was just none. So that's how you could get it. You'd have to sort of tune in that way. It was weird, but it was manageable, but still weird. These days, broadcast on the internet, no one cares. So it was one of those things like, the idea, they were working with what they had. These days, like, oh, that's perfect. Anyway, so I went in there nervously. I remember being very nervous the first time I went there. I was sort of like, would you all be interested? And again, people have been telling me, ever since my voice changed, you should do radio. And I'm like, well, do you even want to talk to me? I was terribly nervous. They're like, okay. And I'm like, okay. And then I took the classes, and then I got more confident in what I was doing and went from there. At the same time, I was also reading things like I discovered alt weeklies for the first time, which, I'm sure I could have read the San Diego ones if I had been thinking about looking for them, but I wasn't. And then I found things like the LA Reader, the LA Weekly, stuff like that. I was reading Greg Araki, the filmmaker. He was a big reviewer for the LA Weekly and introduced me a lot, because he's just old music freak, because anyone who's ever heard any of his films or seen any of his films knows, he's just, he's always on the ball. It's sort of like, here's my new next taste tip soundtrack. It's like, yeah, good. And, so he introduced me to a lot of things, and so did other writers. And also very importantly, in 1989 was the third edition of the Trouser Press Record Guide, which was the famous, the alt record guide of the time. Again, third edition, it already had a couple editions. Third one was a pretty solid volume. And it's sort of like reading it and going like, oh, okay. And I'm learning about a lot of bands for the first time properly. And so 89 is when I do things like, you start picking up Velvet Underground records, and the Bowie reviews were coming out right around that time. So were the Roxy Music ones. And then, things build and build and build from there. And they build in all sorts of crazy different directions. And in a year or two after that, I start reading Melody Maker out of the UK, get a sense of like, because I'm interested in various UK bands. All of a sudden I'm like, oh, there's this magazine that comes over here that I can read weekly because UCLA carried it, and I can learn a lot. Oh, this is fantastic. So I pick up from that. And, and I'd subscribed to Rolling Stone for a while at that point, but Rolling Stone wasn't only giving me so much. It was sort of like, I still remember thinking, how many times you go put Jerry Garcia on the cover? I'm kind of bored here. And all that. Nothing against the Deadheads out there, but I mean, this is me talking from 1990, and I'm like, and or just other things like that. I'm like, I need something more. This is something where history is too locked into the late 60s, early 70s here. I need more, and that's where like all this other stuff came in. So that's really where it gelled. In terms of writing, though, getting to that, when I went to UCI in 92 for grad school, and I had gotten a fellowship, which was really lovely. And so I was able to pursue my grad studies there for 4 years. What I did when I got an MA, and that's all I needed, really. I went on for a bit after that, but eventually pulled the ripcord. I'm like, I'm done. This is not for me anymore. But what happened is that I went to look for the radio station as soon as I got settled on campus, and down the hall in the same building was the campus newspaper. Now, UCLA is a campus newspaper. They're daily, though, and that's a dedicated journalism program. I had written some op-eds for them as part of a little program, but I had to take a formal class if I ever wanted to be a regular writer for them, and I never really had the chance to sort of fit that in. But UCI's paper was, and as think is, just weekly, and it's not organized around a journalism program. It's very informal. There was a professor who taught a little bit of journalism. That was about it. Otherwise, we were kind of on our own. And I walked in and said, do you need writers? They're like, yeah, sure. And I started doing a few pieces, and I said, well, let me start just writing some record reviews, what I do, and doing interviews with bands. I'm like, got to start somewhere. And I did. And within about 6 months, the editor said, like, Ned, you get a lot of content. You're getting a lot of things. Do you want to do a column, write a column reviews? I'm like, sure. And so I became the music columnist for a few years. And Ned's Musical Dustbin, which was also the name of my radio show, riffing on, of course, the band Ned's Atomic Dustbin, which was, because I'm like, as soon as I saw the band name, I was like, oh, well, come on. I have to be a fan. They did put on some good shows. I like them. It was good that but they didn't suck. But in any event, that's where the writing got started informally. And I wrote to some fanzines and things that I got to know through the station and through friends, right? That's sort of 93. We're talking low key ones, but also famously Mean Street zine, which was the monthly big music zine out of the Inland Empire. I think I want to say it was from, but that was a big SoCal thing. And it was one of those things. I knew people who worked for them. So I started doing a little writing for them. And I got used to the idea of, okay, I can sort of make myself known here, even as I'm supposed to be a grad student, but really my interests are like, can I just listen to music all day? The
writing about it is a good way to sort of, justify that. Like, well, I'm writing for it, so I have to listen to it all day. So I need to write this article.
But I'll have there's an important story to tell that I'm going to go back to. That's very important, especially given the theme of what this podcast is about sort of splitting careers. And I will get to it. This is a very important origin story, but I'm going to skip ahead a bit. That I will say that the key thing that happened for me happened in the mid 90s. A friend of mine, Stripey, that's her preferred nickname. She is very much not on the web, not anything. You will never get her real name out of me. Not happening. But one of my many good friend for many decades now. Anyway, big music freak as well. She let me show me her copy of the All Music Guide books, because the All Music Guide was now established in the 90s as an early web resource and meant to be strictly online. But they realized that, hey, here's a way to get attention. Why don't we put together some of these reviews we're putting together for everything and make these overall guides and books that we can publish, a good sort of calling card. And I remember reading through it going like, wow, this is even more extensive than the Trouser Press Guide, because the Trouser Press Guide's brief was, certain, we could say, alt rock, everyone describe it, indie rock, whatever, with certain outliers. Whereas this was trying to take in everything. And I'm going okay, this is kind of where I'm at. This is great. And I noticed a reviewer's name popping up throughout, and because it was a very distinct name, Stephen Thomas Irwin. And I'm like, that's a good name. I'll remember that. And this is where technology tells its own story. And I'll send you links. You can put them up, post it on the page here. That I wrote a story, a 2-part thing for my Patreon last year about me and computers and me and fandom in the 90s, because that has a lot to do with it. And I don't want to totally tell the whole story over again because it would take forever. But the boiled down thing is this. Around 95, 96, my friend Brian and I were both at the radio station. We were starting to get on the web. And because we had enough computer folks around and things like this, because UCI was always fairly heavily big on computers, so there's a natural crossover, and Brian was one of them. Anyway, we decided at the time online mailing lists were a thing for discussion. Pre bulletin boards and then social media and all that. Mid 90s mailing lists were definitely big. And we got this idea of just sort of starting a bunch, because why not? And so Brian started a bunch for things that he liked, and I started a bunch for ones where I liked, including a number of British bands as it happened. I did one. The biggest one was for Oasis. That's its own story. It takes forever. Suede as well. I didn't do an MBV one. There was already a shoegaze or an MBV list out there, so that took care of that. But there were other ones I did too and had going. And after a couple of years later, as the runner of these lists, I'm noticing, okay, just whatever, people are joining, leaving. I get notices on them because I run it. Therefore, I get notifications. And I know somebody joined a couple lists, and I'm like, Stephen Thomas Irwin? It has to be that guy. It has to be. So I just sort of went, and I wrote him and said, hi, I'm the list owner. Do you write for Yo Music Guide? Are you that guy? And he's like, oh, yeah, and all that. And I was sort of like, I like writing about music, but I don't really know where new spots. Would you guys all be at all interested? This is again around 97. And he was like, okay, I'll put you in touch with one of the editors here, and they'll see what they say. Got in touch with him, a guy named Chris Rudstra, and he's like, yeah, sure, send some samples. And I was like, And I looked at my record collection, and I looked at the guide, the published guide, and looked online at their guide, the website at the time. And I thought, okay, here's a couple of things where there's no real listing or maybe like a 1 cent review. Why don't I write a short review and send it in? And I did that with a few of them. They were like, these are good examples. Yeah, please, you're on board. You're one of our freelancers. Come on board. And I was sort of like, oh, okay, this is great. And then that's where it all really clicked in. That's where it suddenly started becoming a thing. And I'll add that the other factor around this time, again, we're talking the end of the 90s, was around the time when Wikipedia starts being a thing too. And Wikipedia, of course, loves references and content and things you look into that. And AllMusic is out there and a free resource and open, and there are formal reviews, and it built up a rep. So there was an intertwining. There was a big intertwining. where we had all music going and people were just adding reviews, and I was adding reviews, and I was filling in all sorts of back catalog stuff. I'm like, oh, gee, well, no one's really talked about Joy Division. Let me talk about that, and let me talk about this, let me talk about things. Let me talk about the fall.
One of the first early voices of these things, so if anybody was learning about these bands in the early aughts, late 90s, early aughts, they were reading your words and your opinions. So kind of.
Yeah. And I have a story about that. Well, what happens is, everything intertwines. And it builds up from there. And I'm also heavily involved with just at that time formed a whole bunch of music fans that found each other through Usenet. And then one of our number, Tom Ewing, had started his online publication Freaky Trigger, still going. And he set up a discussion board for it on another server. It became ILX, I Love Music, I Love Everything, which has been around for almost 25 years now. In fact, it will celebrate its 25th anniversary here really soon, and a lot of writers and editors were joining that. So there was this fizz going on, and I was in the fizz, and I was sort of like, oh, other writers. Oh, I recognize this writer. Oh, this person's editing a thing now, and the connections really built from there. And so steadily, it just went from there. And I mentioned a couple things to go back to in terms of the influence about that. As I said, that intertwining. It's hard for me to gauge the impact I've had because I'm just me, and I'm like, am I writing to the void? I get nice comments and people do say things, but I did get a sense that I had a real sort of impact. I've had people tell me literally they started writing because of me. That's better than gold. And I've had many, many kind compliments over the years. I've had, as you said, people who, approached me and said oh, I learned about this band through you. This is fantastic. I'm like, oh, gee, thank you. One of the best compliments that Stephen Thomas Earlman and I ever got, though, was from the well-known music YouTuber Todd in the Shadows, who's been doing his thing for a number of years now. And, who I freely admit I like more than Needle Drop. Anyway, that's a long story. Fontano does his thing. But anyway, Todd, in a couple of interviews that he did for I think he did one for Billboard and all that, was talking about how he got into music. And he specifically credits Stephen Thomas Earlman and myself for our work in the All Music Guide. He said, when I was a teen, late 90s, early aughts, things like that, I was discovering music, and this is how I found out more about stuff. And I was like, wow, we did have an impact. That's amazing. It's one of those things that, we don't have, it wasn't like a circulating magazine or anything like that. You didn't get a sense of letters to the editor or anything like that, or how many issues you printed. You were just adding to a resource. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you didn't have a subscriber list. We're shipping out 100,000 magazines, and now we're 500,000 magazines.
Right.
You didn't know what it was.
Right.
I want to ask you about the email list. So, or there'd be something people would sign up for, and then would you send out a monthly update on news regarding Oasis? Or you said,
no.
What was the email list? What did that reference? You were collecting information. But what did you send out?
The list. It wasn't a list in that sense. It was sort of like that was a mailing list, but it was more like a discussion list, meaning there was a centralized automatic address. You would send something to it, and it would copy to everyone on the list. So it was a real time email discussion. People would talk about subjects, get things going, reply to messages.
Like a chat room, early version of a chat room, a chat board kind of thing. I see.
But strictly through email, yeah.
And you were moderating it. You were kind of owning it and making sure keeping it on course, moderating. Very cool. And so this brings up so many questions, and I think I want to talk about sort of the shape of music journalism as it is now. But I think for listeners, I think most listeners are about our age. But I always kind of want to just understand the context of for myself growing up in Southern California. You'd have LA Weekly. There was what was the other one?
LA Reader. LA Reader was big.
And then the BAM, was things. There was just always free stuff. Free music press. There was LA Weekly. What was the other one? That was kind of more sleazy. Other than LA Weekly.
Well, there were a few of those.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about. There were also a couple there was you'd have local neighborhood ones too. There was one, I cannot remember the name of it at all, but it was one that was more focused on the West Side because I would find it around Westwood and things like that. But and it was probably Santa Monica too. And I remember they had a couple of good crabby, in a good sense, sometimes less so, but often pretty good music writers for that who I appreciated. And so they were it was the second tier as opposed to LA Weekly and LA Reader.
The spin to
the Rolling Stone. It was sort of the other side of it.
I suppose you could say that. I mean, there weren't bad publications. It was just more focused. And there was a time where you could have in a big city like LA, you could have more local area ones that weren't trying to reach the whole basin. They were concentrating on things like that in the area. So
prior to the internet
like
sort of explosion of it, but it's a place where a young person like myself at the time would learn about music. You'd see like, oh, hey, there's music, just even if it's just reading the music listings, like what's playing at the El Rey this week. Like there's a band called Stereolab. Okay,
right.
And then you can go to the local record store and you pull up the CDs. Like, oh, here's a used one, or here's something that's on sale, or here's something that's cheap, and I can buy it and discover a whole new world. Or in the same way that college radio. I grew up in the Inland Empire, so we had KSPC, and I'd write. I remember like writing down lists of things like, what was it? Blonde Redhead. Like, okay, that sounds like an interesting band.
Cool,
I'll go to Rhino Records this weekend and see if they look through the 7 inches. Oh, look, here's a $5 7-inch from this band called Blonde Redhead. What is this? So I'll buy that, and then they're playing they're going to play at the Troubadour. In 2 months, I see the listing here in the paper. So it was a way of putting it together. But we quickly go from that into then online press and things like blogs and then Pitchfork. I mean, what was I know from my side of it, and Pitchfork played a role in, obviously, in my music career. Our band No Age received favorable reviews, and there was a whole other, but it was a different world. It was a kind of thing where there was a good review or a bad review, could make or break your band, or the gossip, like who said what to who and did what, and so-and-so played a show and did so-and-so did this, or seen photographed of someone. It became kind of almost like foamy and rumor mill grinding too from at a particular time in those late aughts. What was your perspective on sort of the rise of the internet and music journalism and all things like this? Because it sounds like we're kind of getting to that with All Music Guide and things in that way. How did that happen for you?
Okay, well, this takes me back to something I referenced in a very important story that I wanted to get back to, and this allows me to bring that in. But it also, well, let's face it, given the subject you're talking about, Hyphenate, gives you an idea of how I've done my time all this time, because if it hasn't been clear, while I am known, quote unquote, from my music journalism as much as I am, Z-list celebrity, if that, and more like negative Z. I mean, I have no errors. I don't want to have errors on that front, It's one thing to have a healthy ego. It's another thing to, not be realistic about where you're at in life and all that. It's sort of like, some people like my work. That's cool. And known for that, but that's not what I do for a living. Now I'll get back to that. This is the other side of the hyphen. But this all came down to an important discussion. And he knows about this discussion, this exchange on email that was brief but very important. And we've met a number of times since then, and he's well aware of this, and I've thanked him for it. It's very important. I've met Stephen Thomas Irwin now a number of times too. Great guy. I mean, profound impact on my life. I wouldn't have had the full career if it wasn't for that. But as such, I had my fitful efforts, but that's really where everything really turned. That conversation STE and I had back then. But the one that was even earlier, that was even more important, was this. And this is another case of recognizing a name. So I mentioned that I was reading Rolling Stone and things like that kind of regularly once I finally got into it, 88. So it's the music magazine, right? Not realizing, how relatively limited it was. Spin, I always was, you mentioned the sleaze factor. I remember thinking, Guccione, isn't he that, and all that. But there was also the fact that, as later years proved, it's like, oh, they were the ones that were running things for AIDS denialists and things like that. Yeah, great. That's exactly what I want to have. I don't want that, of course, these days, they make her, undersecretary to RFK Jr. or something like that. But, anyway, sure. So I avoid that. But I did pick up a couple of issues of Musician magazine. Now, Musician was always intentionally pro, but reasonably so. It was kind of like, what if you combined something like Guitar Player magazine or something like that with critical analysis, history, and good writers, because who had perspective on things. They were arguably a little more focused towards, popular/critical darlings as opposed to necessarily underground. But there was a lot of stuff in there that would be a little more underground and more interesting. I picked up an issue the first time because it was I mentioned my classic rock phase. This was a mid-1988 issue focusing on Pink Floyd was the cover act, and that's why I picked it up. But for their reunion tour, that version of the band. But there was also a great story from Gina Arnold, who I've gotten to know in recent years, and is a very cool soul. And this was one of her earlier stories when she was a younger writer, talking about the financial realities of indie rock, you could say, and her sample bands that she talked with. And we were talking these bands in this phase of their career, as opposed to later when it might have been different. But this was 87, 88. Was Dag Nasty, if anybody remembers them.
Sure.
Discord connections and things like this. But this was after their move to L.A. Camper Van Beethoven, so well before Cracker had happened. They had just signed to Virgin, I think. And the Dead Milkmen, who hadn't even hit Beelzebub yet, and Punk Rock Girl. That was I think, just happening right around that time. But they had already, of course, made a name for themselves. So the point was sort of like, that was a way for me to learn, like, oh, who are these bands, type of thing. That was getting helpful too. Well, there was also famously a reviews page that it was already well established, that was short reviews from a guy named J.D. Considine. And famously, he would have good capsule reviews. And in a weird way, my All Music Guide reviews, even though they were longer, were sort of like ways to sort of find that model. How can you talk about something intelligently in a compact space? And they weren't long reviews, but they were meant to be. They were sort of like a page worth of good overviews of a lot of interesting albums. And also he was known for his 2-word or 1-character slams of albums that he was just like, garbage and things like that. So he had some reasonably good snark in there. I bring all this up because I mentioned Usenet, that sort of free-floating, conversation space that the early internet had established, and by the early 90s was where a lot of, instant buzz, reaction, chat, etc. things were happening. The mailing lists I ran, you could argue, were sort of what happens when you put some of that spirit into email. Anyway. Early bulletin boards, however you want to describe it. So what happens is that I found myself on Alt Music Alternative around 93 or something like that. And I'm second year into grad school. And grad school is the first time in my academic career of any sort where I'm like, man, I'm really having to work here. Understandably, but it's sort of like, okay, finally maybe hit something of my limit initially. I'm glad I'm on fellowship, but I'm working away. And I'm killing a bit of time on All Music Alternative, getting to know people, meeting friends and things like that. So people become friends too later on. And I noticed a poster there. I'm like, wait, J.D. Considine? It's got to be that J.D. Considine. I mean, why wouldn't it be? Music? Sure, why not? So I wrote him an email. Are you him? And he's like, oh, yeah. And I was like, well, hey, I'm just a very, things. I do a little music writing at my college paper. I sort of introduced where I was at the time. Writing for the UC Irvine paper on music and things like this. And I would have been 22, keep in mind. And this is very important because, he had already been writing, doing writing work and things like this for, I think, 15 years at that point. He was well established. He'd written for other things too, regular freelancer. And I think I said to him at one point saying like, well, gosh, I'm working in grad school and doing that and things like this, but it seems like it's, you seem to have the greatest life. You just be able to sit and write about music. I kind of envy you. And he was sort of like, let me tell you some truths, which was important because here was somebody who was already, if I remember right, supporting a family and things like this, and older than me. So he was sort of like, well, he gave me sort of like a good sit down, kid. Let me tell you the realities. And he spoke about the realities of being a freelancer. And, people talk about all the hustle and things and eight jobs. Then back then, it was just the same. It was a different scale, but it was just the same. He pointed out, you don't know where your next paycheck is coming from unless you've got something on the boil. You're always chasing down your invoices. You're always having to make sure your work. You need to get your food in. You need your money in for rent, for food, if you're supporting a family. This is the type of thing that, it looks idyllic from the outside, but on the inside, it's a much different thing. You got to keep that in mind. And he was kind about it. That was the thing, too. He wasn't like, you don't know anything. He was sort of like, well, this is the realities of it. And I remember thinking at that time in the back of my brain, just going like, that's not for me. I can't handle that. I know I can't. That would not work for me. It just sort of like one of those things like, oh man, that would just be, it just one of those things. I just sort of burrowed in and it stayed with me. And anyway, I mentioned, time goes on, grad school goes on. I mentioned leaving grad school and things like that in late 96 is when I made the decision. I'm like, okay, I got to get out. What do I do? But as I mentioned, I stayed at UC Irvine. So I've always liked reading. I've always liked books. I loved libraries since I was a kid. My jobs in high school and college at UCLA were in libraries. That's where I basically worked. I just knew them. I was a page, obviously, and then I started doing more behind the scenes stuff and just things like this as a student worker. So there it was. I'm like, okay, I need to support myself now. What do I do? I mentioned my friend Stripey. She was working in the library at UC Irvine at the time. She's like, pardon me. She's like, there's an opening that's come up. You might be good for it. It seems like you fit the qualifications. So I read over it and went like, and I applied and I got the job. And I'm like, oh, this is great. So starting in 1997, literally January 2nd, 1997, I began my library career. I'm not a librarian. I want to emphasize, I do not have an MLS or an MLIS, Master of Library Information Science degree. I have a master's degree, but that's in English literature. I didn't want to go back to grad school again. I just left it, and I never have gone back. I've been content to be a library assistant since then, and I've built up my time and experience doing that. So if you ask me what I do for a living, I'd be like, I work in libraries, and that's what I do. I have done many different things, worked on many different projects. I'm public facing. I'm part of what's called Access at the various libraries I've been at, but I've done various behind the scenes things too. Oversees other student workers, volunteer teams, worked on various projects, coordinations in many different contexts, in an academic context, first at UC Irvine for many years, and then since 2015 when I moved here at UCSF, the big medical school, the famous medical school here in the city, as they have a medical library. And I work at a small outlier of that satellite library. So the point is that all this time, while I've been doing the writing, that's not what's keeping me alive. that's not the roof over my head. This has all been to the side. And to get back to your original question and point about writing and internet stuff and things like that. So I've given sort of scattershot way of sort of like talking about things. I was writing for print initially with the student newspaper, with these fanzines, with things like that. When I start writing for the All Music Guide in the late 90s, now I'm writing online. Now there were online journals already happening. I mentioned Freaky Trigger by my friend Tom Ewing. That was one of the first big ones for sure, and big in sense of, hey, there's something here that's concentrating on music and also concentrating on music in a way that is less hidebound than a lot of approaches were. Just a really, really smart place for a lot of smart people to come and talk about things very intelligently. And there were also the equivalent of online journals that people would mail out that were very elaborate. I think Jason Gross had already started Perfect Sound Forever by that point, which of course became its own established online website and still is, to his credit. I mean, I don't say that's thankless work he's done, but he has steadily done this work all this time. Credit to him. He keeps it going. And I've written once or twice for him, and it's a pleasure to have done so. And things like that. Yeah, Pitchfork was off my radar, though. Pitchfork was kind of one of those things, partially because due to my radio work, and I didn't stop doing radio stuff until around 2000. I was still, as a staff member at UC Irvine, I could still have a show, and I did. And I was working at KUCI from 1992 to 2000. So keep in mind, I'm doing a radio show weekly all that time, too. And I only stopped because it was one of those things like, well, the writing's taking off, and I don't have so much time in the day. I think I'll concentrate on just the writing. And if I'd stuck with the show, it would have transitioned to the internet even more, and I probably could have done more with that. But what can you do? I knew where I had to have my cutoff point. But Pitchfork, crept up on me. Pitchfork was one of those things I didn't hear about it in any sort of regular way. And I can't say I was a regular reader either. It was one of those things I heard about, and I think in the early days of ILX, it was probably talked about a bit more. And I'm like, oh, there's this thing over here. Okay. And there were other journals and things started coming out. Stylus was actually something that I ended up writing for more in the middle of the 2000s and on for a few years while it was still going. And then also I was writing more for UK publications because ILX and other things like this introduced me to various UK connected people. And so that's where I did things like Loose Lips Sink Ships, Careless Talk Costs Lives, which was actually the first before that, Plan B, and The Quietus, which grew out of all that and where I've written steadily since then, and various other things. So I had this distant UK audience almost by weird default. It was kind of interesting. It's sort of okay. But The Quietus, of course, is more internet centered. And now, of course, just anyone can get to it. But Pitchfork sort of bopped along. And the story I like to tell about Pitchfork is this. Now, I don't lay the blame on this for any one specific person. This is not something I think how terrible you were and all that. But here's what it came down to. There was, and people remember this, and I remember talking about this time. And keep in mind, Mark Richardson, who's a great guy, was on ILX as well as various other early types from Pitchfork and associated with that. And, Pitchfork had already done things like, the notorious, John Coltrane review, which is everyone's like, ugh, ever since then, and other things like that. They had their missteps. But what happened was that somebody from there, I don't know who, wrote to basically sent out a call to a bunch of different writers who are just like me, making their name, and sort of well-known writers bubbling up is the best way to put it. And I happen to be one of them, and I was far from the only one. This is not something I think of sort of like, oh, wonderful me. It's like, they cast the pool. They cast the net into the pool and so you see who was out there. And the thing is that due to my UK press connections work and other things happening, I got to know a number of UK writers, including people who've been writing for a very long time. And UK freelancing, music freelancing, is a lot more organized, and I don't want to say centralized, but a little more active, at least for a particular generation at that time, but to an extent now too, around trade groups. They have a strength there. They have a focus there that is less so over here. Now, capitalism crushes us all, but the point is there's lots of stuff that they have done, which is what's called the National Union of Journalists and other things like that. And there are other groups and things that actually, do a lot more, aim to earn money for people through various rights organizations, things like that. It's one of those things I'm like, oh boy, it'd be great to have that over here, but the state of labor over here is, so there it is. Yeah. And they had over here pointing out sort of like, Ned, this work you're doing for the All Music Guide is great, but how much are they paying you again? And I said, well, it's this much. And they're like, oh, that's light. These days it might be seen as more princely given how the value of journalism craps, but they're coming from going like, you should only be paying that much. I think they're almost using you. They're almost ripping you off. Are you sure? And I was sort of like, And I thought there could be something to it. And they're also talking about, make sure you got your copyright to what you've got. You should have that because, for you that. And I'm like, this is a good point. And, these are things to keep in mind too. So I kept that in mind. And when the Pitchfork, I got the Pitchfork email, and I was like, oh, okay, potentially interested, but I have a couple of professional questions. And keep in mind, by this point, I had been writing for the All Music Guide for at least 5 years. So it wasn't like, and also increasingly for other weeklies and other things like that. So, just locally and otherwise. So it's like, okay, I'm putting my name out there. So I'm like, okay, I'm not totally a spring chicken. I'm still fairly new at this comparatively, but I'm not out of nowhere. And so I asked, given these points about, pay rates and given the points about rights, I asked, I had a couple of quick questions if you don't mind. And I asked questions about that. And I didn't hear back. They didn't write me back. And my thought was like, okay, hold on. You at Pitchfork, excuse me, you folks at Pitchfork approached me. Not the reverse. I wasn't going like, oh, please take me on and all that. I just, you approached me. And if this is how you're going to treat me, by not responding, even not acknowledging it, do I need you? and I just sort of shrugged and went like, I wasn't like, going like, against them. I was just sort of like, whatever. And I just sort of shrugged it off and went like, okay, fine. You don't need me, or you don't want to deal with this question. That kind of tells me something. Too bad for you. Now, as everyone knows, Pitchfork became increasingly the behemoth. We all know this. Years down the line, I remember asking somebody, it might have been Mark. And again, I don't think Mark was responsible for this at all. I think it was at that time just writing for them. So this is not to be laid at Mark Richardson's feet at all. Keep this in mind. But I remember asking him at one point, saying, Mark, this happened. He's like, oh, yeah, we heard about that. There was bad follow through at that time. We're sorry about that. Again, I don't think it was him, and it's not him. It was somebody else. But he kind of recognized that the organization was still finding its feet and should have responded more professionally, and didn't. And I appreciated that. Eventually, what happened is around the time when it was Jason Green and folks like that and Mark and all in there, I did find a way to start writing things for them. I had a big oral history project about the band Disco Inferno. It found a home at Pitchfork, and that led to some, and I interviewed you for that. I remember I got some quotes for you for that. So there is that connection, just remembered. And then that led to some record reviewing work for them as well for a few years. And I haven't done much for them recently, certainly not since the sale, aside from one rather lovely piece I'm very glad I did about for their Sunday reviews, looking at Depeche Mode's Ultra, which was kind of my tribute to Andrew Fletcher, because this was some months after he died, and I found a way to talk about that album that, while it wasn't dwelling on him being gone, it was a way to sort of honor one of my favorite all-time bands with a really lovely album. But that's the extent of my Pitchfork thing there too. So again, it was one of those things that was interesting being a writer. I don't want to say it was the equivalent of, I don't know, when I was writing for stylists and other things like this, that I'd be like one of those people like, I'm not comparing myself to Lester Bangs, but the people would be like more found in things like Cream back in the 70s, where Rolling Stone was the one that everyone sort of became the thing. Pitchfork became the one, and I'm writing on all these other spots sort of around it during that particular decade in the 2000s, and for better or for worse. And it was sort of those things sort of like, oh, you guys are all right. And, credit to Ryan. Credit to all of them. They built up something from nothing and became a thing. And it's now gone through enough iterations, and there have been enough generations that things have changed. And frankly, its expansion in scope is welcome. It's being owned by Condé Nast, and what they've done to it, not so welcome. But I think it was one of those cases that the context where Ryan started it from, which was fairly oppositional and fairly limited. At the same time, it was trying to like shine a light on things that, again, deserves some playing shine on. But the problem is you can become a cul-de-sac really quickly. And it took some time for an embrace going like, yeah, we can think about things all across the way and do that in different way before, and not just simply be Rolling Stone and things like this and that sort of mindset. Of course, now things have bled over that you get a lot of much better, broader writers in Rolling Stone. Jen Wenner's finally out on his ear, things like that. That took forever. But so it's generational overlays. At the same time, and I'll cast the net a little broadly here. There was something I saw from a very good DJ and writer. She's really great. Why am I forgetting her name? This is bothering me. But it was literally on Instagram today, and her background is she's in New York. It's not Ariel.
Not Jenny. Jenny Ellisque?
No. It's This is bothering me. Oh. Give me a second here.
Okay.
If I don't look this up, I'm going to just my mind will just this will just be dumb. So give me a sec here. I'm going to do some quick searching. Yes, that's it. Ariel Lana. That's it. Okay. It was a DJ and a writer, big electronic music, and she had what was her story thing today? She had a really good post. I know where it is. Hold on. She started a Substack, and one of her first pieces on there was a smiling photo of in the background of good old Fontano, speaking of needle drop, and her comment is, or title of the piece is, "The future of tastemaking can't be white. Can it?" And that is the thing I would say about what we're doing here. What I try to be conscious of is that, here I am, as you can tell, a happily long-witted, will talk your ear off older white guy. And that's why it's one of those things like, my experiences are not these younger writers' experiences. I am glad to be in a situation now where there are people coming up who are already very good writers who are only 25 or, barely older than that. And that's fine. That's good. And who are not me. I'm thinking of writers like Jen Ramos Eisen, who writes who's done a lot of sports stuff for Defector and other things like this, and is starting to think more about writing about music. I'm thinking of Amelia Riggs. She's down in North Carolina, a very good artist, but also a very good thinker about music. I'm thinking of, this is all tied in my head with part of a larger project I'm helping on too, but it's one of those things that's sort of like, I don't want to say I'm done with my generation. That's not true. There are lots of people in my generation who I deeply worship as writers and all that, but you've got to cast your net wide. And if it's just simply another crop of white guys coming in, telling the same stories over and again, we learn nothing and we get nowhere. And that's one of the things I try and keep in mind. And I try not to be as sweeping as I could be. It's sometimes you have to fight against the effort, like, oh, hi, I'm the expert and all that. It's more like you provide a certain perspective and point of expertise in the areas in which you write and what you do. But it's just one view. And it can and should be expanded on, challenged, critiqued if there are points to be raised about it, because otherwise you don't learn. And, having incense lit in front of me just would make no sense. I'm like, no, listen to it and make your own decisions. If there's something I really like that's just not working for you, you're the listener. Good. Talk about, and if there's something you like that I can't stand, but it's working for you, you're the listener. And if you're the writer, write about it, talk about it, do that sort of thing. Don't worry about me.
Yeah, no, it's such a good perspective. We're gonna wrap it up here in just a minute. You've been so kind and generous with your time. The last thing I just wanted to ask, I guess maybe where the two hyphenate sides commingle in the sense of music journalism that has lived online. And we've seen the failings of the archival process of that. MTV News being one of those things, Pitchfork being one of those things. What is your opinion, or what insight do you have about how online journalism in general? We'll focus on music because that's our world. But online journalism, how does that live forward? And what is archival? What is the importance of archival? And what does that look like? How do you see that? You probably have a better perspective than most people on that.
I do. Now, keep in mind, I'm not, as I said, I'm not a librarian, neither am I an archivist, and that's a very specialized area of library studies. However, I've worked with many archivists. I have participated in archival projects, a couple of ones I'm very proud to have participated in, would take too long to delve into. But it's very necessary, thoughtful, and heartfelt work. And digital archiving is a thing, and it is a thing that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to preserve. As we unfortunately see right now, of course, all it takes is a governmental change, and all of a sudden a lot of good information and all that. So, and if there's something I like to emphasize, it's this. Things disappear. And more than, most of my journalism, most of my writing is strictly digital. The fact that most of it can still easily be found is rare. This is partially because a lot of it was still the AMG work, for which I wrote thousands of reviews. The AMG is still around, but it's facing a bit of a money existential crunch. Who knows exactly how long that database will last? Keep in mind, it's been licensed out to many different areas. I'm not thinking the work will just completely disappear. But at the same time, it's one of those things that everything is way more evanescent than I think people understand. Although I'd like to say that if there's been a upside to some of the terrible things we've seen just in recent months in terms of resources disappearing and things like this, it's a recognition that things are indeed that fragile. But anytime one of music publications have shut up shop or just gone under, or their websites have disappeared and all that, it's like your work's gone. So I've been telling people for years, save your work, archive your work, at least keep copies of it around, and back that up several times. Keep it in more than one location. Keep your hard drives, there's a key hard drive here with a lot of my stuff on it, as opposed to, there's the cloud. Yes. But, is the cloud always guaranteed? No. And do I have a key hard drive right here next to my monitor where I found stuff? Yes. Is that the only one I have? No. There's a full hard backup at my parents' place, like 3 hours drive away, precisely because if something terrible happened here, there's something off site with it all on there. And, these are the, and this is just, this is light compared to some people I know who will back up things many times over. And again, quite understandably. If there's something I just want to impress upon young writers, is that for the sakes of your CVs, or resumes, or your body works, your equivalent of your clippings and things like this, don't just rely on the fact that something is there to be like the be all and end all. Those URLs could disappear. Those credits can change. The work I did, for instance, for the SF Weekly for about a year when I first moved here, if you look for it now, you can't look for it by my name. It's just credited to staff writer. You have to know exactly what I was writing about to look for it. It's like, that's great. Things like that, So you find things like this where you have to keep track of your own life to the best possible way. And that way you can do things around. Now, I will say something that is a suggestion, and this is just one model, and I'm not trying to present this as a solution, but I find it very heartening. There is a group, a small little group of writers and archivists and folks who keep these things organized out in the UK, led by Barney Hoskins, well-known writer, called Rockspack Pages. And for years, they have acted as granted, Anglophonic, I believe, but maybe not just that. I need to do deeper dives. Ways that if you are a published writer and have a lot of work, or a fair amount of work, they sort of like, you'd like to make sure backed up. The idea is that when I talked to them about it, when I met one of them at a conference last year, I was like, yeah, what's the deal with that exactly? I was like, oh yeah, you can just send us links of stuff and we'll put it up there for you. And not in a haphazard way. The way they do it is, in my case, I think probably for everyone else, is that if you have things you like to submit, you can do that. And then they sort of be the curator for you. And the nice thing about this is you're letting someone else look at your professional life and determine what will be interesting. And they put things up once a week. So they'll add a new piece of mine from the 90s through now, from the range of archive things they have. It could be a review. It can be an interview. It can be an audio interview. It can be one of my recordings. It can be a preview. It can be an essay. It can be whatever. And I like that because is it a universal collection? No, it is not. You've got to maintain your own things. But that's a way for it to sort of thrive in a professional context for music writers that is with the pool of other music writer stuff that you read in. And so like, oh, here's a way to work through this. Now, this is just one enterprise, one focused thing. And again, rocksbackpages.com. It's out there. Take a look. And I have my entry. And you have to subscribe to get full access to it. That's how they get their money to do that. And I think, yeah, that's well worth that. I will say again for writers that who might fit with the bailiwick that if you do get your stuff on there, you get a free membership. Isn't that nice? So the importance here is that you've got to think broadly in terms of how your work will survive is the best way to put it, because you can't rely on a publication being there forever. As long as some publication has been around, it's great that Rolling Stone has been around now for, coming up on 60 years. That's fantastic. Is it always going to be around? Can you predict it will always be around? If your work has been done for it is predominantly digital, will that always stay? Keep in mind that, many of us writers who have predominantly written digitally, that doesn't mean your work's going to last. I pretty much assume that my work is not going to last. That sounds depressing, but rather it's one of those things that way I'm sort of built in against disappointment. If it does find a way to survive, if there is stuff about my work that, people find valuable well down the line, after I'm gone, great, fantastic. I don't have any errors, but there are many people out there who I work with value well more above more of mine. And I'd like to see their work survive. And again, in the context we're at, it's going to be hard. And it will require people with foresight, people with resources, people awareness about how both digital and, where possible, hard copy preservation of so many of these things can thrive. What's the best way to do that when there is so much digital content? As I told people in a piece last year, stop thinking the Internet Archive is going to save you. They do their best. I met Brewster Colley, great guy. They're doing their best. That's not your permanent backup either. They'd be the first ones to say that. So it's, when I've seen the argument, to get back to conclude on this point of archiving, I've seen the argument saying that we'll know a lot more in future years. People will know a lot more about the 20th century than the 21st. On the one hand, we've had a wider range of voices. And podcasts like these are a good example. Many different people being able to write more, audiences more, build up things more. It's truly a broader field than it was. You compare that to, say, the 1950s, where you'd have, noted news magazines and then, small printed private press stuff. And that's really about it. And again, it was always skewed towards a very particular thing. Not that it can't be skewed either. But again, these days, you can say a lot. The Internet's promise, however compromised, at least allows for that. But the flip is that Marx is right. All that is solid could dissolve into air, just like that, or melt into air. There's a real truth there, and the Internet really makes that true. So we have to be cautious. Do what you can, preserve what you can, try it in different ways. Keep in mind that you should be your own best editor, your own best curator, if you really want to make sure that there are key things that you've done really good work on. But cross your fingers and hope for the best. That's really all it comes down to.
Always make copies and save them in different locations. I mean, with the big fires we had here through Southern California, just ripped through so many creative people, important artists, and important writers, performers.
I'm not going to be flip about that. That's a classic example of just something, things are irreplaceable if you're not careful.
And some of those, those friends we had in Altadena, it was really minutes. What do you grab? You take your pets, your medicine,
and I don't blame anybody.
The hard drive with all the records. Yeah.
I don't blame anybody for not thinking in those terms, because most of us can't, because most of us are not in that kind of survival mode. That's the whole point. Life has been, more comfortable in that regard. You can do things, but this can happen. This can happen. Yeah.
We have examples
we should be prepared for it.
Yeah. Well, Ned, I feel like we could do this for weeks and months and on to years. You've been fantastic. This is probably the least I've talked on an episode, but it's been.
Believe me, part of me was sort of like, should I keep going on? It was more a dialogue. I'm sorry about that.
No, I love it. It's great. No, it's been very, very informative, and obviously you've thought a lot about these things. So I'm very happy to hear. You go with it. I would have interrupted you if I. Well, thanks. You've mentioned there's a few places where people can find you. Let's give a clear, concise shout out. Where can people support you? Let's start there with the money, and then where else can they find you, and how else do they know you?
Things like that. Well, the easiest way, if you want to throw me a couple of bucks, it's a $5 a month charge. There's just one tier. Is Patreon is where my individual writing pops up. I try and write a piece of some sort once a week. I'm not going to say either any of them are deathless, but they've been a chance for me to sort of write about things, just sort of like just sort of stretch my things things. Sometimes talk about film, sometimes it's memories, a lot of times music. It used to be more in the sense of like a few songs per thing. And now often I'm talking about like, sort of deep dives in particular concerts. Sometimes it can be a mix of things. It really all depends. So patreon.com, Ned Raggett. And as I always say, Raggett is spelled with 2 G's and 2 T's, Raggett. So that's how to find me. Please don't drop the second T. That's so there's that. If you want to find me on social media, Blue Sky is probably your best option. Ned Raggett on there. I am on Facebook still. I have a vestigial presence on Instagram at this point. You can also find me more over in the Fediverse with stuff like that. So I'm on Mastodon. When it comes to photos, I'm on PixelFed. I'm on a PixelFed server. So there's that. In terms of other work I do, that also happens completely differently. This is maybe my library side kicking in. Not library stuff, I say, but I do have my own podcast that is done with 2 friends of mine, Jared Pekacek, a very good writer, literally had an award-winning fantasy novel, his first novel, The West Passage, pick up things this year. It's fantastic. And Oriana Schwint, who's a great screener, great journalist, great screenwriter. She and her husband have an independent film coming out later this year called Sight Unseen, going to be great. And me, and we talk about Tolkien. We are huge Tolkien nerds. I was the one who came up with the idea of this back in late 2018. Proposed it to him. I got to know him through Twitter when Twitter was good-ish, and got on board. And we've been going now for over 6 years. Monthly podcast. It is called By the Bywater. It is by Tolkien obsessives, but we are neither new to Tolkien nor are we deep scholars who will go into the minutiae. We are enthusiastic readers and appreciators. And Tolkien has impacted us in various ways in our lives over the years. And we do a monthly podcast where we pick a subject, an issue, an interpretation. We've done the movies, things like that. Megaphonic.fm/By the Bywater is our homepage. We're on all your services. We're out there. You're easy enough to find. Apple, Spotify, whatever. YouTube even. But we are up to now. Yeah, our next episode our most recent episode just came out earlier this week. Yes. And the next episode in June will be our 75th. So it's a new little milestone we've got. So if you can stand hearing me talk, and trust me, in that one, Jared and Ryan and I more bounce it off each other and things like that. So it won't just be me, but that's where to also find me more.
That sounds epic. Awesome, Ned. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on.
All right. You're welcome. Been a real pleasure.
Yes, Ned, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. There it is. I love nerd stuff. It's so fun being nerdy. Go sign up for Ned's Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ned Raggett, NEDRAGGETT. And then you can also find his Dungeons and Dragons podcast. What is his WordPress, nedraggett.wordpress.com. And so many great Ned Raggett pieces out there online. Bandcamp is full of it. Full of it, yeah. Full of his great content. Oh, now I'm just reading online here. The Incredible Austerity of D&D, 1980. This is published on June 3rd, 2025. IXOR.com. Anyway, so much good stuff out there. The internet is filled with Ned Raggett. Go find it. Go read his interview with Kevin Shields. It inspired me as a young man to continue searching for music and searching for sounds and making weird sounds whenever I was able to. And, it was instrumental to my experimental guitar playing obsessions as a young man that led me here today. So Ned, thank you for doing the good work. Thank you for fighting the good fight and for covering great musicians and giving your 2 cents and sharing your perspective with the world. I will forever be in debt to the writings of Ned Raggett, and I'm happy to celebrate him and all of his body of work here online. Everybody wants to get in touch with me. You can find me on the Instagram at Randy S. Randall. You can also write to the show, hyphenatehalftime@gmail.com. And have a good weekend. Stay safe. I'll see you on Monday.
in brief, that's where it all started. And the short version from there, because again, I could go on forever, is I get used to the fact that there's this thing called radio in the late 70s. By 81, I have asked my mom, 10 years old, I've asked my mom if I can have a radio. I'm listening to top 40 nonstop.